Hi, my name is François. This video is the last one of a series of 3 videos dedicated to COVID-19 and IP. In this video, we will discuss about the TRIPS flexibilities. TRIPS flexibilities are applicable to the 168 countries in the world who signed the TRIPS agreement. TRIPS agreement provide for a certain number of rules to protect the patentee right to exclude others from using, manufacturing the invention. However, TRIPS agreement provide for the possibility for members to limit or suspend temporarily the rights of patentee in case of health crisis or national emergency. We will discuss today how flexibilities can be used to make it possible, once a vaccine or a medicine is found, to supply people in need. The flexibilities are a certain number of cases where the TRIPS agreement authorize members to adopt their own IP rules or to suspend or limit the patentee exclusive right to exclude third parties from making, selling, importing the invention. The first flexibility is that the TRIPS agreement provides that countries can implement a more extensive protection than what is foreseen in the TRIPS agreement. For instance, a country can decide that the duration of a patent will be 30 years. It cannot decide that it will be 10 years because the TRIPS provides that the patent duration is 20 years, but the country can decide to go over. The second flexibility is about exclusion right. I won't enter into the detail at this stage because it will be discussed a bit later in the presentation. Another flexibility is that countries can exclude from patentability a few things. These are inventions that, even though they are invention and could be patented as such, can be excluded from patentability. And you've got invention who go against public order or morality, invention related to human and animal treatment and diagnostic. I won't go into the detail, but we've seen that in another video previously. Then also invention regarding plants and animals. Another flexibility is a research exception, meaning that if you are doing R&D, you are allowed to manufacture patented product without committing any sort of infringement. You cannot do any commercial activity under the research exception, but as long as you stay inside a R&D project, you can use patented invention. Another flexibility is the Bollard exception. It means that in the framework of obtaining some authorization to put a medicine on the market, you are allowed to put in practice the invention to prepare this authorization, for instance, by making some sort of test. Another flexibility is the compulsory license. Again, I will not go into details because we will discuss this a bit further in the video. Another flexibility is the possibility for members to authorize utility models, or what we call small or petty patents. Exhaustion and parallel import are one of the TRIPS flexibilities. Exhaustion is a legal doctrine where an IP right holder cannot prevent the further distribution or resale of goods after consenting to the first sale. It goes together with the parallel import, which is the import of a genuine is very important, that is first put on the market in another country with the authorization of the right holder. The question is, if the good was put on sale in another territory with the patentee consent, can this good be imported inside another country? The question of exhaustion is a flexibility because TRIPS is very clear that nothing in the agreement can oblige in any way any of the member states to respect rules concerning exhaustion. It means that each country is free to adopt its own rule concerning exhaustion and parallel import. This principle of Article 6 of the TRIPS was reminded again in the Doha Declaration concerning the medicine, where it was restated that each member is free to establish its own regime of exhaustion. So the countries had the possibility to decide on their own. Some countries like India decided for an international exhaustion, which means that when a product is put on the market anywhere in the world with the consent of the patentee, such good can be lawfully imported in India. Another possibility for exhaustion regime is to adopt a regional exhaustion regime, and it was done in EU, and it makes a lot of sense because EU wants a free flow of goods inside the Union. And so it was ruled very early in the EU life that exhaustion is valid when the first sale was done inside the European Economic Agreement, which means EU plus another few countries like Norway or Switzerland. But if the first sale was done outside EEA, there is no exhaustion right, which means, for instance, that if a medicine is put on the market in US, it cannot be imported in Europe under the exhaustion regime. Compulsory licenses is another TRIPS flexibility. The compulsory licenses system makes it possible for a member state to suspend some patentees a right. Through this mechanism, it is possible for a member to oblige the patentee to give a compulsory license to the state itself or to a manufacturer or a seller. The TRIPS agreement provides with basic condition that must be met each time a compulsory license is issued. The first condition is that the compulsory license must be an individual decision on a certain product and certain patent. Second, it must have preceded with unsuccessful effort to obtain reasonable terms and conditions, which means that before granting a compulsory licenses, the state must do whatever it can to negotiate in good faith a normal license. Third condition is that the duration and scope of the license must be limited to what is needed. So, for instance, if you have a health crisis at a certain time, you can, of course, issue a compulsory license for the duration of the health crisis, but you should not continue the compulsory license after the health crisis is over. Another condition which gave rise to a lot of problems is that the compulsory licenses is predominantly for supply of the domestic market. This is and was a problem because it means that a country can only issue a compulsory license if it is to supply its own market, and it is not possible to issue a compulsory license to supply a market abroad. It gave rise to a lot of difficulties, which I will discuss a bit later in the presentation. Just to mention that a waiver is possible, so the problem is now considered to be solved for a certain number of countries. The compulsory license, another condition is that the compulsory license is non-exclusive. It means that the patentee still have the right to sell the product or manufacture the product on its own in the country, and can also give a license to a third party. Another condition is that the compulsory license must be terminated when it is no longer needed. And finally, the state must provide for the payment of an adequate remuneration of the patentee. All of these conditions can be found in Article 31 of the TRIPS agreement. You find the first one, that is that the authorization is based on individual merits. The B, which means that there must be some effort to find a license on reasonable commercial terms with the patentees. C, scope and duration of the use shall be limited for the purpose. D, the license is not exclusive. E, it's non-assignable. F, this is for the supply of the domestic market, and this is the one that is posing some problem. It's very well known under 31F. Then you have the remuneration, Israeli patent law is quite interesting in regard to compulsory license. Israeli patent law provides for a lot of cases where a compulsory license can be used. First of all, we have non-working patent, but we will see that a bit in 1 minute concerning the patent abuse. You have a provision concerning dependent patent. This is the situation where you cannot exploit a patent because this patent is dependent on another previous one. And to exploit your invention, you need to obtain a license on the previous patent. So Israeli law provides the possibility to grant a compulsory license in case of a dependent patent. You have also a compulsory license possible for public interest and government use. This is quite a usual provision that you can find all over the world. Then you have the possibility to issue a compulsory license to correct patent abuse. This is a possibility opened by the TRIPS agreement, but not a lot of countries actually use this possibility to provide a compulsory license in case of patent abuse. Israeli patent law provides for this possibility, and what is interesting to see is what is considered as a patent abuse. First case, the product or the demand for the product is not satisfied in Israel on reasonable terms. Another possibility is that the condition to supply the product or grant a license is not fair. It's a matter of fairness. 3, it's the case where exploitation of the invention by way of production in Israel is impossible or restricted. You can see restriction, and of course Israel is quite sensitive to embargo issues. Then you've got a 4th case where the product is not produced in Israel and the patent holder refused to grant a license to a local producer. And then a 5th case is where there is a refusal to grant a license on reasonable terms because of export to Israel is prevented, or that the launching and or development in Israel of a commercial or industrial activity is prevented. So what we can see here is that the wording of the Israeli patent law concerning patent abuse and compulsory license is indeed quite broad. Then we have finally the possibility to grant a compulsory license for medical purposes. This is also a possibility foreseen in the TRIPS agreement that is quite widely used around the world. So there is the possibility for compulsory license if there is no reasonable quantity of medical supplies on a patented medication or even medical device of medical purposes. Israel is a very good example of the use of a compulsory license in the case of COVID-19. it shows that the use of a compulsory license or the threat of using a compulsory license oblige medicine companies to provide enough medicine or to give a license on a medicine that is not available in a country. It was the case recently in Israel with the antiviral medicine Kaletra, which was used for HIV. And the government of Israel issued a compulsory license on Kaletra only to be used in the treatment of COVID-19, not on HIV. Here you can find the decision, because a compulsory license is at least a decision. That was taken by the Minister of Health of Israel, saying that in accordance with the power vested and pursuant section 112, we just saw this section, I hereby grant permission to the emergency department and to Kim International Limited, so this is an authorization to a private company, to exploit the invention protected in a certain number of patents by way of importation of lopinavir, which is the Kaletra, one of the two medicines that enters into the composition of Kaletra, for the sole purpose of medicinal treatment of corona patients. And so it is confirmed that the permission to exploit is necessary in the interest of the maintenance of essential supply and services. This is exactly a decision implementing a compulsory license. And the result of that is also extremely interesting, because a few hours after the granting of the compulsory license, AbbVie, which is the owner of the patent and the producer of Kaletra, granted itself a license on its own, so I would say a voluntary license, to purchase abroad versions of the medicine for supplying Israel. The question of active pharmaceutical ingredients and Article 31 bis of the TRIPS is extremely important in the case of the pharmaceutical industry. The reason is very simple, as we have seen in the COVID-19 crisis. 80% of the production of the active ingredients of medicine is manufactured in China or in India. It means that if a country like Israel, Kenya, or even Germany grant a compulsory license, this compulsory license is valid only in the countries who grants the compulsory license. And you remember that we have seen that Article 31F of the TRIPS says that the compulsory license can only be used mainly in the country where the compulsory license is issued. So we come to the conclusion that if Germany grants a compulsory license, it cannot force China to issue itself a compulsory license to be able to provide Germany. The scheme is exactly this one. You have a medicine that is created in an R&D center somewhere, for instance, in Europe. The drug company patent the medicine and the active pharmaceutical ingredients. Then, the drug company outsources the production of API, for instance, in China. So you have a manufacturer in China who is making the active pharmaceutical ingredients. Then, in Africa, for instance, there is a health crisis in country A. This country in Africa issues a compulsory license because there is a health crisis. A local manufacturer of this country in Africa received the right to manufacture and sell the medicine. However, this manufacturer in Africa needs the API that is produced in China. So the local manufacturer in country A requests to be supplied from China for API. Then comes the problem. The problem comes that country B, which is, for instance, in this case, China, cannot issue a compulsory license to oblige API manufacturer to sell to A because the license must be predominantly for the supply of the domestic market. So the whole system is blocked. There were a lot of negotiation because, of course, this is not a satisfactory situation for countries, especially least developed countries, and because also most of the production of API is done in China and in India. So there was a lot of negotiation, and it came to the amendment of the TRIP, where you have an Article 31 bis, which provides now that country B, so the country of production, is allowed to issue a compulsory license on its side to enable its own manufacturer to export to the country A. Country A is what we call in the TRIPS agreement an eligible importer, and a few developed countries like EU, like US, like Japan, have said that they will never use Article 31 bis of the TRIPS. It means, in relation to the COVID-19, that if a European countries grant a compulsory license on a medicine on COVID-19, this European country cannot have the benefit of Article 31 bis, which make it impossible for the production country like China or India to force its own manufacturer to supply this European country. A few years ago it was not a problem because Article 31 bis was mainly used or considered to be used by least developed countries. But of course, that might be a problem in the case of COVID-19 because there will not be a lot of differences because the situation in Africa or the situation in Europe. If there is a medicine, it will take time to produce this medicine, and so European nations could face a problem of accessibility to this medicine, and maybe they would like to use compulsory license under Article 31 and make use of Article 31 bis But obviously, this is not possible today because EU, US and Japan renounced to import API using Article 31 bis. So what does it look like in the TRIPS agreement? We have Article 31, which relate to other use without authorization of the right holder. This means compulsory license. There are a few conditions, and we have the condition 31F, which says that the use granted by the license shall be authorized predominantly for the supply of the domestic market. So we saw that this is the problem in case of an active ingredient produced in a third country like China or India. Then you have Article 31 bis, which says that 31F shall not apply with respect to the compulsory license necessary for the purpose of a production of a pharmaceutical product and its export to, and the word here is important, eligible importing members. So there are two conditions for 31 bis. It must be for the purpose of a production of a pharmaceutical product, and the export must be done in an eligible country. And who are these eligible countries? It's interesting. So eligible importing country means least developed country and any other member, so that should be any country on earth that has made a notification of its intention to use the system. But it may be understood that a member may notify at any time that it will use the system in whole or in a limited way. And some members will not use the system as importing members. And this is the situation for US, for European countries, Japan and a few other countries. They have said, they have notified to the World Trade Organization that they would not be considered as an eligible importing country. And so they are blocked to import API from China or India because the compulsory license that they may issue in their own country is not valid there, and China cannot issue on its own a compulsory license to oblige its own producer to supply these European or US importing countries.